Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Pascal Brückner. I'm working for the Computer Emergency Response Team at TU Dresden, and I want to briefly talk about the so-called HPC incident, which happened in the summer of 2020, during which researchers lost access to those supercomputers they normally use for their research. And the news outlets at that time were just talking about a certain unknown security incident. And there was a lot of speculation as to what really happened during that time. In fact, more than 12 HPC centers in Germany alone went offline, even more across Europe. And there was also speculation that this could be somehow connected to the research in terms of the COVID, the pandemic, and many other speculations. And since we in Dresden operate one of these supercomputers, we were also affected by that incident, and I want to show you what we figured out, because we performed the forensic investigation at our site, and I will show you what we figured out there. But first, let's talk about HPC computing in general. So this is the more formal term for supercomputers. HPC stands for high performance computing, and it essentially means that to perform really expensive operations, for really large tasks, such as scientific simulations, one can put dozens or thousands of computers together to perform that task. And these big clusters of computers are then called supercomputers or HPC centers, and used by researchers across the globe to perform the simulations, for example, for weather forecasts or even biological simulations. When operating such supercomputers, there are a number of IT security challenges connected to that. The first one is obviously that such a system isn't only used by our researchers in Dresden, for example, but it can be used by researchers from all over the globe. And this also means that there should be some kind of access for them over the internet, which exposes the cluster to all the threats you usually have in the internet. Even though the cluster isn't directly accessible from the internet, there's still a way to get there. And yeah, that's always associated with some kind of risk. Also, the primary goals when operating such a cluster are performance and availability, and all these IT security goals are not first-class citizens there. So it's always a trade-off between security goals and the goals of the operators themselves. And the last thing, which played a big role in this particular incident, is that security updates on these clusters are often delayed. So in normal computing, you are used to the tip that you please always have the latest software, but in on these systems, that's not so easy. There are a lot of reasons for that, but in the end, they aren't always running the latest version of whatever software you need, which also includes security problems. So for the incident itself, in May 2020, there was another German HPC center which discovered a malicious backdoor, so malicious software that enabled attackers to get access to their cluster on one of their systems. And they informed all the other HPC centers in Germany immediately, including us. And we also started looking for those so-called indicators of compromise, the things they found over there. We could find something similar on our systems. And indeed, we did find exactly the same indicators of compromise also on our systems, which was also this backdoor, which was placed on quite a few of our nodes in our clusters. So for multiple weeks, HPC centers across Europe who all were affected shut down. They closed up for external access and performed intensive forensic investigation to figure out what happened there. So yeah, since we in Dresden also have one of those clusters, this is what we figured out. First, let's look at a healthy cluster which isn't affected. It essentially looks like this. There is in the middle this huge array of green so-called compute nodes. Those are computers, thousands of them, on which the scientific research tasks run in the end. A researcher who uses that cluster accesses it via the login nodes on the upper left side right here. And he logs in there and then can start his tasks on the compute node and use that. And most of these tasks produce results, gigabytes or terabytes of data, which somehow needs to be extracted. And that's what the export nodes are for. So the researchers then can extract their generated data from their simulations via these export nodes to the internet. All these compute nodes, the login nodes, and the export nodes are also connected via so-called shared network storage, which allows every user of that system to have their personal data, their code, and their generated data accessible from all of these nodes at the same time. And there's also a bunch of administrative systems, of course, which are used by the cluster operators to manage that clusters, add new nodes, add new users, and so on and so forth. Our specific cluster in Dresden looks quite similar to that generic design. I just assigned a few names here. So our most important administrative node is admin 0. There are those login nodes, login 4 to 6, some export nodes. And I named two compute nodes here because they were important in the attack. And if we look at the attack itself, the initial reason the attack was able to be successfully carried out was that the researchers who have legitimate access to these login nodes, some of them lost their credentials for these clusters. And since, at least at the time, there wasn't a second factor except just a very long password they could use to access those nodes, an attacker who got that password could just use it to log into our cluster or to any other cluster. So some researchers lost their credentials. We don't know how that happened. There are a lot of reasons, malware, phishing attempts, whatever. And since there was no further protection than that single password, it could just be abused by others. And what was even worse is that some of these researchers even used the same very long password, but for multiple HPC centers they wanted to access, which was really bad because in the end, an attacker who got that password could use it to access any other cluster. So when one of those legitimate researchers accessed the login nodes, one of the attackers came with him. He used the same password, and we discovered that the attacker then logged onto two of the compute nodes. And he figured out that the software on those compute nodes wasn't quite up to date. And they figured out that there was a known bug at the time, which was from 2018, and they abused that bug and used it to gain administrative access to these compute nodes. They then went further on to look over the system to find further weaknesses they could abuse to further enhance their access to our clusters. And they found one of those, which was a configuration issue, which was related with those shared network storage blocks down here. And using that or abusing that configuration issue, they were also able to get access to more nodes, specifically the login nodes. And they were also able to get administrative access on them. Then there was a couple of hours, 3 or 4 hours, where the attackers just looked through the system. They searched extensively for more weaknesses they could abuse to essentially compromise the whole cluster. And we figured out that they, in the end, were able to do that because they found a third weakness, which were credentials they were able to obtain from the systems they already had compromised. And with these credentials, they were able to access the head node of the cluster, which was this admin 0 node. And having administrative access on that node as an attacker, that's essentially the master key for the whole building. So from there, they were able to just access and compromise all the other nodes as well. And on all those nodes, they placed their backdoor, which gave them access to come back later and do whatever they want with our cluster. So the bottom line there was that the earliest attacks started already in 2019, not in our case, but also in others. Also, the attackers abused the login credentials of HPC users. They used exploits for weaknesses that were already known at that time and that were specifically tailored to those target systems. They placed backdoors over all those systems, and all these properties make this the perfect advanced persistent threat, the APT, which is a term commonly used in IT security. But there were also some upsides to this. especially since once all those indicators of compromises were known, we could quickly discover all of our affected systems. We also found no further abuse of our cluster, so there was no indication that the attackers came back and actually used their backdoor to our cluster, which was quite nice to figure out. And as far as I know, most other institutions came to the same conclusion. So the actual damage from this hack was mostly in the downtime of the cluster, the time to do this whole investigation, and then reset up the HPC system from scratch. And also there's another positive outcome, since right now the HPC community figured out that there should be something done in terms of how users authenticate against their systems. So right now there is an initiative to have stronger authentication schemes to use two-factor authentication for HPC computing, for example. So if you're interested in more details about this hack, there's also another write-up where I go into more technical details of this incident. Please have a look at the following link, and thank you for listening.